Welcome to Section 3 of NIEM Advanced Technical Concepts. Now, what we covered in Section 2 was, frankly, a whirlwind overview of XML and XML schema. What we're going to cover here in Part 3 is, well, more XML schema. We're going to look at XML schema in depth, and particularly in the context of the NIEM. So that means XML schema, that means namespaces, that means a in-depth look at type declarations, and that also includes inheritance, which is connected with type declarations. So hold on tight as we learn a lot more about XML schema and we start to actually learn about the NIEM. We'll start with just a quick overview of XML schema. XML schema defines what an instance document can look like. So that's the idea behind XML schema. It's a means of defining what the instance document needs to look like. And then if you can do that, then you can have meaningful data exchanges with people by first understanding the schema. XML schema includes the concept of data types, things like integers, things like strings, things like booleans. Those kind of data types are included. It also includes containers for other elements. Elements don't just contain data, they can contain other elements as well. XML schema uses namespaces as a way to organize and group related elements together. Now, the bottom line is XML schema is really powerful, but it's also important to know that it has limitations. There's a lot of things that XML schema just isn't up to defining, and we'll talk about that and some means of getting around that way later in the training materials. Our first topic is going to be namespaces. Now, what namespaces do is it provides an additional layer of context for element names. And what do I mean by that? Well, it lets you have textually identical names mean different things depending on the context in which it's found. Well, let's look at the word case, for example. It's a simple word, case. What does it mean? Well, what the word case means depends strongly on the context in which it's being used. If you're in the context of a court, it can mean any proceeding in a court of law whereby an individual seeks a legal remedy. You know, I've got a court case. That's one that's familiar in the judicial context and environment. But there are other contexts as well in which you use the word case. Say, in terms of luggage, a smaller portable container for enclosing something. I've got a case, a valise. I'm bringing my case with me. A briefcase would be another example of that. What about in the context of food and drink containers? A box with its content. I have a case of soda, or a case of beer if that's what floats your boat. That's another word for case, or another meaning for case. What about mysteries? Sherlock Holmes solves the case of the speckled band. So that's kind of case as well. It's kind of related to a court case, same kind of idea, but a little bit different. Or you can have a medical context where it's an instance of a disease. I have a case of the flu, or my dad would always say that I have a case of lethargy, which is frankly truer than I'd like to admit. So 5 different contexts in which the word case has different meanings. And there are more as well. There's construction context where a case is kind of the frame surrounding a window or a door. There are others. There's one in terms of playing cards, poker, where it's a certain kind of hand. I don't know if it's poker, but one of the card games. There are additional contexts. And what namespaces do is provides a means for specifying that context so that you can have the same word, have it appear in different contexts and have different meanings without any confusion. So that in XML, if I say something is a case, I can identify whether I'm talking about a court case, a medical case, or a case of soda pop. The NIEM uses namespaces to identify and organize different sections of the NIEM. So there's a namespace for NIEM core. There are namespaces for each domain. Each domain has one namespace. There are namespaces for the code list authorities. Each authority has a namespace. There are namespaces for the different infrastructure pieces, and then there are namespaces for external standards as well. Does that list of different areas sound familiar? Well, that's because it is. That's directly from this diagram that we had back in the first section of Advanced Technical Concepts. Each circle here, or each oval, represents not only a schema in the NIEM, but also a namespace. One schema per namespace, one namespace per schema, and each of these circles has a namespace. So you see each of those domains has their own namespace. Children, Youth, and Family Services, they have a namespace. Justice, they have a namespace. And the thing with the domains then is that means that the Children, Youth, and Family Services domain can use a term that means something special in their community, while somebody else, say CBRN, might use the same term but have an entirely different meaning for it. But because we have namespaces, we can tell which context the term is being used in. So there's no collision there. There's no confusion. If somebody uses term X, we can tell which version of term X we're talking about by looking at the namespace. NIEM Core also has a namespace, and then each of the three support pieces, proxy, structures, and app info, they each have a namespace as well to identify them. External standards also have namespaces as well, both actual true full-blown external standards as well as the code tables. So the FBI code tables, they have their own namespace. The FIPS code tables, they have their own namespace as well. Namespaces provide the context so that we know what each term means, and different contexts can use the same term and still have different meanings for it. Now each namespace has a name, and it's a long name. It's called a Uniform Resource Identifier, or URI. It's actually different from a URL in that a URL defines a location where there actually is something. A URI doesn't necessarily specify a location, but they look like URLs, and they kind of act like URLs, and it's not a bad idea to have something at that location as if it were a URL, but it's not required. So just so you know that, you're going to see these names and go, ooh, that's a URL, and technically it's not. It's a URI and doesn't necessarily lead somewhere. So we have an example here, and it's the Children, Youth, and Family Services domain. And you see everything between the quotes, well, that's the URI. That's the name for this namespace. And each piece means something. The NIEM.gov is the authoritative body. It's the NIEM, so that's NIEM.gov, and they own that. The NIEM as a whole owns that. The next one is the directory for NIEM stuff. The idea here is that if the NIEM.gov community has some other standards that aren't technically NIEM, those could go into other directories. The next section you'll see says domains, and that's a framework layer. Remember we saw just the previous slide, we saw these different layers, and the domains all go inside the domain directory. There are other directories for some of the other layers. Then we see the domain itself, CIFS. Depending on the domain, it'll say different things. It might say emergency management there. It might say justice. In this case, it says CIFS. It could say Children, Youth, and Family Services, but that's awful long. Between the next two slashes is a namespace version, 2.1, and that'll change as the versioning changes. Now, this isn't something that's binding. This is just a convention that we in the NIEM use. We put the namespace version there in the URI to help mark them. And then the last thing, the /1, that's for our domain update. So this really isn't 2.1. This is 2.1.1 sort of. So the one there is for the domain update. Since CIFS is the only domain with a domain update outside of actual minor releases, this is the only URI for a domain that you'll see that has that little /1 at the end. Wow, that's a mouthful, isn't it? It sure would suck to have to say every time you wanted to refer to this namespace, say, well, http://NIEM.gov/NIEM/domain/CIFS/2.1/1. That's just horrible. So luckily, namespaces have a way of setting up nicknames for them. And that's the part to the left of the equals sign. You'll see XMLNS, which stands for XML namespace, CIFS, CYFS. And what that does is it defines what's called a namespace prefix. Instead of using that full URI, every time we want to talk about this particular namespace, we can just stick a CIFS : in front of the elements that are from that namespace. So it's a nickname for the namespace as a whole. It doesn't have to be CIFS. It could be George. For all the parser cares, it could be George, as long as you consistently use George as the prefix for elements and you use George in this declaration here, everything would work fine. But we try to make them meaningful. So this here is a list of all the namespace prefixes in the NIEM, and you'll see we try to make them short yet meaningful. So you've got NIEM Core, its prefix is NC for NIEM Core, and you'll see that an awful lot in any NIEM work you do. Structures has a prefix of S, App Info has a prefix of I. The proxy namespace, it is NIEM-XSD, and that kind of signifies that what the proxy does is apply some NIEM stuff to some of the XSD or XML schema data types. Maritime is M. Chem, Bio, Radiation, Nuclear is CBRN. Screening is SCR. Children, Youth, and Family Services, which is quite a mouthful, is just CYFS, C-Y-F-S. Again, that's CYFS, not CFS or anything else. We've decided CYFS is the pronunciation. Justice is a little J. Immigration is IM. Emergency Management is EM. Infrastructure Protection is IP. Remember, that's not intellectual property. In the NIEM, IP is infrastructure protection. International Trade is IT. Again, in the NIEM, that's not information technology, it's international trade. And then finally, the existing older family services domain, which has been deprecated by CYFS, is just FS for family services. So you'll still see that, but you shouldn't be using that because you should be using the CYFS domain instead.